we ready? All right, so I'm Mark Collier with the OpenStack Foundation, and here with me today we have a number of experts in not just taking selfies, but also NFV. So we're going to be talking about network functions, virtualization, and just to set a little bit of context, I don't know if everybody realizes just how fast this transition's coming on, but we're actually seeing some of the largest companies in the world, largest mobile operators in the world embracing OpenStack to virtualize their networks. One of the interesting stats I recently read was that in the first quarter, there were actually more new connections for automobiles, for connected cars, than for smartphones amongst the major carriers in the US. So that just gives you an idea when you think about connected cars, IoT, how rapidly these changes are coming on. This isn't 5 years in the future. This is right now. Mobile carriers are actually connecting new devices more quickly that aren't phones than actually are smartphones. So that's changing really quickly. Tesla, for example, has an autopilot self-driving car now, and they've already collected data on over 1 billion kilometers of driving by these owners of this early Tesla technology for gathering data and creating self-driving cars. So it's really becoming real much faster than people think, and it's changing the way that telecom operators and companies that partner with them are doing business to respond to that. So with that, I want to go ahead and give everyone a chance to introduce themselves.
Hello everyone, I'm Gal Sagi. I'm an open source software architect working for Huawei, devoting my work to open source. I presented earlier project Dragonflow, which is a Neutron implementation that we're working on. I'm also working in the areas of containers, bridging the gaps between containers, frameworks, and OpenStack. And also, of course, in the areas of service chaining and NFV.
Shalom, I'm Kristoff, and I'm basically from Nuage Networks. I was here earlier at the keynote, and we are an SDN vendor, and we participate in OpenStack, and we took the carrier-grade code from Nokia, which I'm sure you guys know who Nokia is. They make phones. Telco stuff, and we repackaged it around the APIs, and now we have an SDN solution for OpenStack.
I'm Gideon Kempfer, architect at the HP Context Stream, also TSC member of Open Daylight, so I take part in a little bit of open source and certainly related to Neutron and OpenStack.
And hi, my name is Eva Cohen. I'm with Mellanox. I apologize for my voice. I hope you have to hear it again. I apologize for that. I didn't know I'm going to sit here. I'm leading the cloud activities at Mellanox. Basically, we're doing interconnect, and in the cloud, a lot, the three foundations are compute, storage, and network, especially as you look at telco, where network is the game, is the application. So networking is a critical element, and Mellanox is trying to make it better for the cloud.
Excellent. So I mentioned NFV is network functions virtualization, but there are probably a few folks out there that don't quite know what that means or what the scope of that is. So does somebody want to take a stab at just defining what NFV is and why it matters to telcos?
Well, I'll speak in Ariz's name because he doesn't have a good voice. Actually, Jeremy told me this has to be a funny panel, so I looked up NFE Jokes on Google, and there were no results. You can check. So apparently everything is true. But seriously, NFV is the telecom vendor attempt to transform from a world of custom hardware to a world of using custom off-the-shelf servers and software to perform actually the exact same tasks that they were doing before, and getting in return the flexibility, agility, and cost reduction that typically other enterprises are getting from their IT units. And this is what we call the ITification of the telecom industry. So I hope that describes it in a few words.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. You did a really good job there. Thank you. Yeah, and I think that.
For that, you know, they said it needs to be funny, so they brought me only because of my voice. That's the funny part here. So.
All right, so ITification of Telco. So I think that that's a really good description to give everybody a sense for what's happening. The fixed function, proprietary hardware is kind of the model of the past, and now people are moving towards more of a software-defined approach. But what else is changing within the telecom world in terms of, if they're going to embrace not just the technology of OpenStack and these SDN plugins, but culturally in terms of hiring? We heard a bit from AT&T earlier and others about how they're ramping up hiring. They have AT&T has an innovation center here in Israel. But does anybody have any thoughts on how that's changing the organizations fundamentally in order for them to embrace NFV? Sure you do.
People that know software. I mean, the world is being eaten by software. And I actually tried to come up with something funny, and then I realized it's an NFV panel, and I'm usually quite funny, and I ran out of ideas. So this is my attempt at funny, right? No, the point is, I think what we're seeing at least is that OpenStack is massively being adopted by the telcos. AT&T, I'm sure there's a few AT&T people here. Definitely trailblazing in this area. And from my selfish point of view, because I work for an SDN vendor, is we'd like to see the adoption increase, and you need software people, software-minded people, developer-oriented people and processes, and that's kind of where I see the market shifting to, from more specialized proprietary boxes.
So let's talk about OpenStack and the state of NFV. Is we've heard OpenStack is in 70 plus data centers in AT&T, Verizon. Was mentioned earlier as being a large NFV implementation. Is OpenStack really ready to be part of NFV in production? Are we kind of at the very early stages? I mean, what are some different points of view on that?
To me, we are still in the early stages. I think that NFV and service chain in general provides a lot of flexibility and a lot of new ways to deploy services for telecom. We can think about how we move latency services between the core, between the edge and the aggregate in our cloud, and we get a lot of options and a lot of flexibility and scalability of our services. I think that OpenStack is slowly adopting features that are going to support NFV and help it, like the SRIOV integration and smart scheduling, but it's still lacking when it comes to areas like distributed NFV and controlling distributed locations. And I think there is I heard some new interesting projects that are starting in OpenStack Austin, and I hope that we'll continue this path, because it's really simplifying and improving the way that telecom are running their services.
I completely agree, and I think that actually it goes both ways, right? So OpenStack is adapting to NFV. It's not there yet. It's definitely going there. But at the same time, NFV itself is new, and the NFV market doesn't yet know exactly what it needs, and there will be a lot of adaptation also from that kind of telco world towards the cloud. The cloudification of telco is something that will require some time. For example, if you look at the previous times doing high availability, when you have appliances and they need to be 5 nines available at all time, that's not the way cloud work. And if you look at the large Web 2 guys, the Googles and the Facebooks and so on, they look at high availability in a very different way. And one of the values of NFV is not only to be able to run on x86 hardware, it's also the ability to take advantage of the high availability of cloud or the nature of cloud, where you basically can just respond, scale out and down in a very agile way, and be able to replace a whole rack with another rack in an instant. So the NFV world itself is kind of trying to figure out what should be the requirements and how they should meet their needs into OpenStack. There are organizations like the OP NFV, which it's an organization, open source organization, but nevertheless one of the major parts of this organization is really to define the needs and define the specs that will be later on pushed or developed partially by themselves, but mostly by OpenStack and also by the Linux kernels and other open source organizations. So it's really a two-way, and it will take some time until I think everything will kind of be ready. But I completely agree. It's coming very fast. I think within a year or two we'll start to see very large deployments already.
So I'm glad you mentioned kind of OPNFV and some of the other groups, because I think what those groups have done is, like as you said, most of what they're doing is requirements, and then when they're gathering the development resources to the extent it's relevant to OpenStack, they're doing that work upstream, so they're not really trying to do it kind of off on their own. They're really trying to do it in coordination with the OpenStack community, which is the right way to do it. And so I guess the question I have is, how is that changing the traditional role of standards bodies? So in the past, with these fixed function kind of proprietary pieces of hardware, those were built after lots of discussion about specs and things got ratified, and then implementation started. And it seems like it's kind of, the model's turning on its head a little bit, and as things are going to software over hardware, open source being the dominant way to innovate in software, you see kind of the standards being driven more from implementation first, or prototypes in code and iterating. Is that changing, the role of standards bodies in the telecom world from the traditional method?
I think I'll surprise you a little bit. I think it isn't changing. But what's changing is the definition of those developers, those vendors. So when you used to go in the telecom industry to the IETF, for instance, and you'd define a new MPLS standard or whatever you have out there, the truth is, and everyone knows this is the case, there is an implementation. Some vendor has implemented something and wants to turn it into a standard, right? But of course, politically correct would be to go to the standard organization and describe the idea you have and persuade others to join the team, and then that becomes a standard, and the de facto first implementation normally is quite close to that standard. So what has changed is the definition of a vendor, really, because an open source community is now that vendor. So when you develop OpenStack, or you develop Open Daylight, or you develop whatever open source project you like, and then that becomes the industry de facto standard, you've basically done the same thing. You don't really need now to persuade others because it's already a community. But the implementation always predates the standard, and I think that's the case today as well. So that's true for our NFV in particular.
Yeah, that's a really good insight. Does anyone want to add anything to that?
I think it's important to turn up to events like this, if you're a vendor, and that's, at least I was pushing for us to be here in Tel Aviv and participate, because you pick up information from all your peers, and that's kind of how these things come about, ideas and projects and sharing and being in it, to actually be in it. And then also you can download the Etsy white paper, which I highly recommend, and I just downloaded it again just to refresh my mind. For those that actually don't know NFV, download it, it's very useful. So that's kind of where I see the trajectory, I mean, look at all the vendors here today. That's the trend, you can't be in a silo if you're a vendor, you have to be somewhere participating.
That's great. Well, I think that, from my point of view, I think that's very healthy and helps markets grow faster, because we have the collective wisdom of all the smartest people that, are never going to be locked up in one company. And so if we can work across companies, we're going to get where we want to be a lot faster. And so I guess, we're definitely seeing that from the OpenStack perspective. Obviously, the AT&T's spoken here quite a lot and has a lot of development resources. China Mobile is another one I just want to mention. They have 850 million subscribers, which is kind of a staggering number. And it's the largest mobile carrier in the world, and they're one of the top contributors to OpenStack in the last cycle. And so I think that the balance of power, or kind of the linear nature perhaps of how things were built in terms of vendors and then the supply chain selling in a linear fashion, to a certain extent to the telecom industry has changed quite a bit, and you see a lot more active development, it sounds like, from the people who are ultimately your customers. Do you feel that you really, I guess as you said it, you have to participate to kind of be seen as a relevant vendor these days?
You have to be at the party.
Have to be at the party. That's
Yeah.
interesting you mentioned party, because
It's a party, yeah.
we're the only people in this panel standing between you all and free beer. So that's how important this panel is.
Just to mention, we are working for Huawei. So, and we are pretty much, our team is actually pioneering all the open source way, and I think that I'm personally noticing a revolution in the way that people in China and in Huawei are looking at open source and are adopting, and they are investing a lot of resource on our projects and on other projects. And I think this goes to show the real power of open source, because the adoption of open source, and I don't completely agree with the remark about the standard bodies, because I think that open source now is actually pushing things, because OpenNFV is defining requirements and defining standards, but in the end you need to implement these standards, and the real power to push things and features and implementation is for the people and the companies that are actually contributing and working on the projects, and to me that's a great thing.
Good. I was hoping we have some disagreement, but probably not a huge disagreement. But yeah, go ahead.
I don't disagree.
Come on.
No, everything's cool. I mean, he's saying the right thing. I think it's what you just described about people in China picking on open source projects, and that kind of global reach is kind of phenomenal about people collaborating. That hasn't really happened in the past. Certainly, probably not in the telco space. For us, we're a distributed company. We have people working in Belgium and Israel, all over the place, and we participate with others. My boss is on the IETF, and that kind of stuff obviously goes on, but we're seeing a real revolution because of the open source approach that everybody's doing. So you're totally right.
So I know that you all have customers outside of NFV, and one of the questions I hear quite often is, okay, OpenStack has really started to put, as a community, a lot of focus on NFV. There's this huge opportunity, IoT, and all these things. But what does that mean for enterprise or public cloud? So, does anybody have any thoughts on where you're seeing crossover? So, in other words, work that's going on to make OpenStack more scalable, reliable, and so forth for NFV. Does that have value in other markets that you're serving?
I think one of the features, one of the main features for NFV that I see being pushed to OpenStack is service chaining, service function chaining, and I think it's still early. The API is still not mature enough. There's a lot of experience even here in the crowd of companies like ContextStream and HB, which were doing service chaining, and there are still disagreement of how the API should look like. But if I'm looking at a few steps ahead, and I think that service chaining and the ability to attach services and provide these services for east-west traffic, just like for north-south traffic, may find very useful for private clouds, just like for public clouds or telecom users.
Yeah, again, I'll add for you. Since we, I think, share a passion for performance, and I think the telecom industry is certainly driving the performance aspect of the public cloud or cloud infrastructure. So I think that is something that's going to affect other enterprises just as much. I mean, there are enterprises that are network performance oriented as well, and they will certainly benefit from this, even though the early adopters or pushers of the technology come from the telecom industry. That doesn't matter. That doesn't mean it's going to be just contained there. So certainly it will spill over.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, even before performance, I think that the fact that huge organizations that have a lot of money, like AT&T and China Telco, China Mobile, Orange, and so on, are getting into OpenStack will push OpenStack to be much better. First, you know, there's much more users, much more testing. That will harden OpenStack to a very different level than what we used to, and I think that will benefit everybody. Every OpenStack user will gain from this. Other than that, really, and I completely agree. You know, the performance aspect was kind of left aside in OpenStack, and the flexibility and automation, the software-defined, was kind of the key factor. But in the end of the day, when you build a system, the efficiency of the system is critical, and performance is just another way to say efficiency, because then you need less hardware, or you can do more with the same hardware. It will benefit the general enterprise. It will definitely benefit another new market segment that we see rising, which is the scientific computing. We're seeing OpenStack taking off in a lot of research institutes, universities, commercial high-performance computing, you know, the aerospace industry, the car industry, the pharmaceutical industry. All of those industries used to run on bare metal in the clusters where they ran kind of parallel jobs, and now they're going to take OpenStack and use that as the infrastructure, and for them performance is critical. So actually we're seeing kind of a lot of forces joining together to drive performance out of OpenStack. So this is one hand. The other hand, which is actually quite interesting, I think, is that now that NFV will become relatively available through the standard clouds, companies that are not telco will be able to get into telco level very quickly. So we're starting to see that from companies like Google, for example, that they are becoming a threat to telco because they can become very quickly the next telco provider, and they can, you know, take another market share. But with OpenStack providing the capability together with the OP and NFV releases and so on, the barrier to become a provider, it's still not small, but it getting smaller. So actually, I think OpenStack will benefit, but also the telco industry will get more players, and it will become more kind of a challenging environment that we all can benefit from.
Excellent. Well, I agree. And I think, you know, one of the things that we're starting to see across OpenStack that applies in the NFV world as well is this emergence of, you know, talked about calling it the lamp stack of cloud, but really the idea that if you look at an OpenStack cloud, whether it's for NFV or otherwise, there are a lot of other open source technologies there, sometimes, you know, closed source as well. But what are some of the other pieces of technology you typically see in an NFV implementation that would be plugged into OpenStack or running on top or underneath, however you want to think about it? Do you have any things thoughts on that?
Well, I think it exists in the NFV standards, in the NFV white paper. Even the Mano model is basically already mentioning part of that, which includes, of course, an orchestration system on the top, where OpenStack is the classical virtual infrastructure manager, or VIM, for those familiar with the ETSI terminology. And of course, the SDN control side, which I believe will become also part of this standard stack blueprint, and I think Open Daylight is an excellent example of that for SDN control, where really it's quite clear, I think, today in the industry that OpenStack by itself won't pull it in terms of controlling the virtual switches or SRIOV NICs or whatever, and there is a need for another layer below that. And there are various SDN controllers out there. not to mention some on this panel by Huawei, for instance, and Nuage, and so I think most of the panel probably agrees on that too.
I think the major shift that I'm seeing is DevOps, which is probably the most overused word of 2016 at this point. But no, seriously, I mean, having the privilege to work with actual, real DevOps customers who do continuous delivery to the network, it's pretty phenomenal when you actually see it, like features being pushed out every few minutes, that kind of thing, and functionality that didn't exist until you actually adopt proper automation, orchestration, and that is all software driven. So, that continuous delivery of these features and functions is going to be key.
I think the first step would be the functions themselves operate in the latency and the performance that is needed. And the second step, as was mentioned here, is orchestration. Finding the right place to place a service, playing with where the service is, if it's on the edge or if it's on the core, depending on the cost, depending on the latency and the service itself. And of course, as was also mentioned, the networking that connect between all of these services, the networking that will now need to balance between these services and how we scale, and again this relates to the orchestration, how we scale these services in an efficient way.
So you mentioned that DevOps is perhaps the most overused word of the year so far in the early counting, and I would just suggest that perhaps Docker or containers might give it a run for its money, but I believe containers are relevant in this technology stack for a lot of NFV implementations. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think containers were last year.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
All right, I'll concede that point.
Yeah, that's so 15. Actually, late fall 2015. No, but I think containers are absolutely correct. The people that the customers and people that we work with, they deploy containers and they connect it through our APIs. And you can containerize functions too. That's not a problem, but it's the delivery of these things, right? So you need to orchestrate, automate every bit of your estate in order to deliver functions very quickly. That's the successful thing, right? If you can deploy things quickly, give the services and features to the customers and end users, or whatever you're doing as fast as possible, you win the game. And that requires a DevOps-like methodology, right? And that's all software-driven culture and software definition. So, at least in my space, I see that. I think you would agree with the orchestration bit.
Yeah, I think when we are looking at containers, the main benefit that I see is the orchestration and the scaling of the services using platforms like Kubernetes. And the other aspect is the deployment simplicity of these functions. But I think it's still early to speak about containers and functions. We haven't yet figured out the last step, so I think maybe we're jumping too quickly, but I definitely see this happening in the future.
Actually, I'd like to disagree a little bit because otherwise it's not interesting. So,
all right. No beer if we don't disagree like 2 more times.
Right. So, okay, thank you. I was told that in the first NFV forum, unfortunately I wasn't able to travel there, somewhere in France, telecom vendors were talking about a virtual machine, a single virtual machine spanning multiple physical servers. I'm sure there are people here in the crowd that remember that. And as you know, that's not true. That's not the way virtual machines are typically used. There's a virtual machine runs on a single physical server. So that's about 4 years ago. So telecom vendors have learned a little bit about virtualization since then. But I remember I was playing around with virtual machines back, let's say, 12 years ago, and I wasn't an early adopter. So That was 4 years ago. I don't think the telecom industry is ready for containers yet. I mean, let's let the other enterprises work with containers, and they're developing that, and they're getting all excited about that. And the telecom vendors will follow, I'm sure. But we'll stop at virtual machines at this point, I think.
Okay. Well, I wanted to just take a moment to see if we had any questions in the audience. Since you're all here, you're not just waiting on beer, you probably also are interested in NFV, some of you, I hope. So, you got a question here. Oh, so I'm sorry.
Oh,
Nadi's handing
Okay.
the mic.
Okay, so I wanted to ask about OpenStack, NFV, and cybersecurity, because this is a major challenge, I think, for moving to NFV. And it's not just bringing down some applications if someone attacks the cloud or the data center, it also bring down the whole network services, and maybe millions of users who lose their service. So, are there any thoughts on this matter? Are there any initiatives in this area on OpenStack?
Yeah, so security obviously is a critical element. By the way, not only for NFV, but as you rightly said, it will have a huge impact for security holes. And I think we need to look at security in general, the trends. There are several trends. One of the interesting trends is if in the past people try to have a clean perimeter and have kind of islands that are secured, today the enforcement or the security elements are pushing as close as possible to the VM, so they're moving into the hosts and sometimes really on the edge of the VM. So this is one trend we're seeing, and that kind of add quite a lot of complexity in the provisioning of the firewalls and the other elements. The second thing we're seeing is encryption. Clouds are moving to be fully encrypted. We're seeing that strong requirements from all our customers and partners. They wish to go to a mode where as soon as the data leave the host, it is encrypted, either if it's networking or storage or anything else. So there's a lot of investment on that, both in software, the way to configure it and to provision it, as well as in specific hardware acceleration to enable wire speed encryption in high performance. This is what Mellanox see.
So on the security side, one of the use cases for SDN is security. So the enforcement at the network layer and some of the work that we've been doing, and the Open vSwitch guys with stateful ACL and tracking, connection tracking, and all of that stuff is heading in the right direction to really make the network as secure as possible, which is one element of this, right? And that's the adoption rate of SDN that we're seeing. And that's probably why you saw in the survey also now the increase in OVS adoption, which I think is like 69% or something? Yeah. So that's where I see it in my view of the world, which is very SDN focused around OpenStack. And you need to be able to scale this, and you need to be able to do it also in an automated and orchestrated fashion, so that when security issues do arise, and this is where continuous delivery kicks in, you have a feedback loop and you detect these things quickly and you react, because everything is done through software methodologies, and this is the same for NFV. So SDN is a big, giant part of this, especially when you're talking about network virtualization of functions, right? You need a smart, intelligent, programmable surface.
I actually going to tackle this. I'm not sure if this is what you meant, but I think there is a lot of work that is needed in protecting the infrastructure itself, the OpenStack services and the way they communicate. And this is something that is, to me, is not yet there. For example, in Dragonflow, one of the reasons we picked the pluggable database was to be able to configure ACLs. So if you have a compromised host, you don't want it to have access to your entire networking infrastructure. So we are trying in small bits to improve the situation now.
So I know there was another question. Let's see if we can.
Yeah. So there's obviously a lot of agreements, and we do, by now we all realize what should be done in NFV and how to bring up an essentially virtual environment for network functions. So my question is, like, where are the areas you mostly encounter disagreements? This is the first part of the question, and the second part is, like, do you encounter, how often do you encounter people trying to solve problems in NFV area using old methodologies and old way of thinking where the devices were physical devices and trying to build the same, the same solutions in the virtual environment, not realizing they're not bound anymore to the infrastructure. How often do you encounter these scenarios, and what's your approach and take on this?
I think it's an excellent question. Indeed, I think, especially in the early days of NFV, people were trying to mimic what they had in the physical networks and transform that one-to-one to a virtual environment. It's what we call the first stage of NFV. So basically just replicating what you had. If you had two appliances connected to each other, and now you have two VMs connected to each other by a virtual network. And then or maybe it was just even software running on bare metal, not even virtualized. Then the second step was virtualization. Going forward, I believe the next step should be a decomposition of these VNFs into fine-grained services or microservices, if you like, which introduces the opportunity of providing a common infrastructure that can make the VNFs much smaller, what we call lean VNFs versus heavyweight fat VNFs. For instance, every VNF out there today being developed has to include its own high availability, its own scalability or load balancing mechanisms, and those functions can actually become part of the infrastructure once they are decomposed, because it doesn't really make sense that a function that does X and needs to have load balancing should just re-implement the same code that a function Y needs to do with the same infrastructure requirements. So I think in this aspect, there's still many VNFs out there and VNF vendors that really have done just the first step. So basically turning their hardware appliances into software VNFs, VMs. The next step is something that we're reaching towards, but we're not yet there. And I think that certainly is a place where we're really seeing challenges in the industry, both in terms of decomposition, where vendors are kind of, that means a significant change in the implementation. So the applications are not yet what you call Googleized, so they're not ready for deployment on real clouds, on real fluid infrastructures. And that step will take time, I think, and that is also a big opportunity for new vendors to bring in the same functions but implement it really for the cloud.
I completely agree. I mean, I would answer the same thing. So I'll address the first question because he answered the second one very well.
Just lost the beer.
Mark, I agree.
I think he lost the beer, right? Because he agrees, right?
He's the one losing the beer, right?
We haven't finished.
He knows what to do.
Yeah. No, so let's go back to the first question. The question was where the problem is really. I mean, everybody agrees and it's a beautiful day and everything, but there are disagreements, and I think the disagreements really boil down to, in the end of the day, it's still companies that have business agenda driving driving making money. This is why most of us are here, with all the respect to the peace and love and everything else, the open source community, people here are making money. And I think what, at least in OPNFV, where I see the hardest battles are around standardization, around hardware offloads. In the end of the day, people understand that you cannot do everything in software. The control plane can definitely be done and should be done in software. It should be software defined, but if you would like to run the entire world traffic, videos, voice, big data, we mentioned the data is growing significantly fast. We try to get real-time analytics. A car needs to take a decision if to turn or not, or to stop an autonomous car in a split of a second based on a lot of data. So this cannot be done in software. We'll need hardware acceleration. And there, I think we have the biggest problems. Hardware vendors, and there are few in the world, find it very hard to agree on standards around how to define those standards. So this is, if you look at OpenNFV and specifically the DPAC, the Data Plane Acceleration Working Group within OpenNFV, that's kind of an interesting place. Hopefully, with Mellanox at least, we are trying to derive at least APIs that will not be hardware agnostic, that will not be hardware dependent, following standards like OpenFlow and other such solutions. But this is definitely an interesting area to look.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm actually going to disagree slightly with you.
Yeah, we have a
Yeah, and I love the weather, and it's making me very happy here too in Tel Aviv. But I'll just say this, right? We're a pretty new vendor, if you want to say, and we're a Pureplay Software vendor. So you're right. I mean, there's innovation on the hardware side, but I think the question was directed as, do you want to elevate all that capability up into software? And you don't need to elevate everything, right? There's just certain things you want to do in software and decouple it from hardware so that you can do things like go multi-vendor. So abstraction is a very, very big key of this, and it's in the Etsy white paper too, because you want to bring in multi-vendor and innovation, right? So you have to abstract through software, and at least for us that's important because we can then let the customer choose what the best hardware underlay is based on whatever the use cases are.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not saying that it should be hardware independent. All I'm saying is that the APIs needs to be independent. Actually, Etsy also define a custom, hardware vendor specifics, but I'm not getting into that. What I'm saying is that in the end of the day, you cannot run the data plane solely on software. The control plane needs to be able to control any hardware, that's for sure. But we will need to come up with ways to accelerate the traffic, otherwise we'll build on the lowest common denominator, and with that we'll just have a very inefficient environment.
One last question, actually for me. And I wanted to raise the elephant in the room in a way, the business model. We are talking about OpenStack as an open source thing, but we all know that a lot of the DNFs and a lot of the NFV solutions are not open source, and the question is on the business model. Do you see a contradiction between NFV and the traditional business model? And if so, and I think AT&T is a great example of something that could be built on open source, and obviously the Cisco type of model, if you like. Do you see a conflict between that? And if you do, because it is different than I think the model that each of those companies I think are in the banner right now are selling, and how do you see that changing, if at all, the business model?
Well, I think it depends on what layer of the solution are we talking. In the end of the day, it's not an appliance. It's the whole point is the aggregation of the solution and the ability to provide different vendors for each of them. So if I try from the bottom up, from the hardware perspective, I don't see a difference. I think that the same business model will remain. Mellanox direction is towards open hardware. If you look at our Ethernet solutions, we are enabling any operating system, network operating system, to manage our switches, including Linux operating system. It can run and manage our switches, while others are trying to kind of close and provide a complete solution end-to-end. Mellanox believes in open, but if you look from a business perspective, the hardware vendors, I think, will keep them more or less the same business model, just will enable new markets for us. And then if in the rest of the solution, I think things will definitely change. If you look at the old days, then the Nokias or whatever would provide a complete solution for the telco as an integrated solution. I think that now some customers or operators will continue this way, but some will do pick and match. That they'll buy hardware from this guy and they'll buy the orchestration for that guy, and the VNFs will not necessarily come from a single entity. So I think it will be much more flexible. And that will also change the business model a little bit.
Yeah, I think I can represent both sides of the thinking, because originally coming from ContextStream, which was a startup, we developed based on open source, but the solution itself was still not upstreamed. And that was the traditional way of thinking in terms of making revenue out of a product that nobody could actually copy one-to-one at least. It was based on open source, but there were additional proprietary additions to that. And then we were acquired by HPE. And in HPE, the thinking is completely the opposite. It's quite clear to the company that the way forward is via open source and collaboration. And there's no one vendor that can lead the industry and push forward a winning solution without collaborating with others. And it's not out of sheer love, it's because of necessity. And that means that the business model changes as well, which means you don't get to earn revenue or significant revenue just because you're providing a product, which anyone else really has. Of course, there are bug fixes and there are all kinds of tricks that some vendors use in terms of getting revenue because the they dispatched hasn't been upstream. But in general, it's still the same open source. The revenue stream comes from professional services, from support, from installability, the lifecycle management. Things are typically the packaging of the open source, where open source is still lacking a little bit. So that is the true source of revenue to come. And if the company is large enough, and fortunately for HPE, for instance, we also make some servers. So we're also a hardware vendor in a sense. If you provide a solution, and it doesn't necessarily have to run your full stack. It can run some of your stack, it can run none of your stack, but you're really providing a solution, so you can still make revenue in other points. So when I go to my boss's boss and have to explain why we need to invest in OpenStack and Open Daylight and things like that, and he asks, show me the money, that's basically the question, then the money doesn't come from selling that open source, of course. The money comes from our ability to play in the market and sell things that are really the hard currency in the end to the company. So it doesn't necessarily have to come from there directly. And of course, the professional services.
I just realized I'm the only software company on this panel. Like, we don't make hardware. So for my business model, but Nuage, we're a Pureplay SDN vendor, and so what we do take is the BGP code, right? So we decoupled it from the hardware in software. So our business model is pretty simple, right? We make one version of software and we replicate it 1 billion times because it's digital, right? So it's a pretty software-centric business model, and we innovate the features in the software decoupled from hardware. And the benefits are, for the customers, they can pick from any of these guys whatever hardware they want, and it's totally fine, you know? And that's a differentiator, I think, between the different SDN vendors out there when you look at how they address the market right now.
I do think things are changing a bit, because I think that the same pricing model and the same models can't stay. For example, you had a DDoS protection box in your enterprise, and now this is running as a service in the edge or in your provider cloud. These are different things, and we're going to see some pay-per-use models and SLA models and things, and upgrading models that are relatively different than what we are used to. To me, and this relates to the last question as well, a very big challenge is how we integrate all of these services with the SDN controllers and with the SDN solution. This is a problem that I'm actually very interested in looking at recently. Usually when you take a solution, it comes with its own set of services, and I think the way to integrate and connect between different solutions is still not well defined to get a seamless integration.
All right, so I believe that's all the time we have. we're going to hear, is there going to be a drawing, or I see something?
Yeah, there
What's
is a
interesting
drawing,
there?
and that's the last thing between one ear and the peer.
First, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you guys for the panel. You did a great job.
Thank you. I believe after this that there'll not only be beer but some snacks to munch on, and that should be a good time. But we got one more exciting drawing.
One more exciting thing going. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. So who wants to come up and, pull something out of the hat? Allison? No.
Allison!
Come on, Allison. Heidi?
Allison!
Someone. Okay. All right, guys. First of all, thank you everybody for being here. This is actually, I think, the largest crowd we've ever had at the end of the event, and that I think is saying something. And I hope you guys enjoyed the Ignite and the NFV panel towards the end. I think everything was really, really interesting today, and we hope to see you guys throughout the year. We have meetups, OpenStack Israel meetup on meetup.com, and various other ways. You'll get emails from us once in a while, things like that. We hope to see you guys around, and we'll go ahead and move on right away to picking a winner. It might take a few times because who knows who's dropped it in. Okay, yellow.
Yellow 64.
It's like bingo. Yellow 64. Yellow 64. Not after, but
White 64.
Not after, but B 64. No, nobody yellow B64. We're gonna move on then. We got green.
Green 4.
Green 4. Come on. Yeah, we have a winner. Woo! Winner chicken dinner. Okay, Moshe. Mazal tov. Okay, and Allison, tell Moshe what you won. All right, drop the ball.
Oh, a free ticket to the Barcelona Summit in October.
Woo! All right, good job. We'll be in touch.